Britain was once a superpower. In 1976, it begged the IMF for money. This is the story of how the country that once ruled a quarter of the planet ended up at the International Monetary Fund, begging for the largest emergency loan the IMF had ever made. If you're worried about where America's debt is heading, what happened to Britain should hold your attention, because the warning signs look unsettlingly familiar. When World War II ended in 1945, Britain walked away as one of the big three powers. With an empire, the Commonwealth, and the pound sitting beside the dollar as a global reserve currency. Fast forward 31 years, and the British Chancellor of the Exchequer was nursing a gin and tonic in the VIP lounge at Heathrow Airport when word arrived that the pound was collapsing. Turning around, he drove straight back to the Treasury, and the next morning he announced that Great Britain was applying to the IMF for a bailout. The Economist summed it up in 3 words, declaring that the British government is bust. How does a former superpower end up borrowing $3.9 billion, roughly $22 billion in today's money, just to keep its currency from breaking apart? The story begins in the early 1970s, when Conservative Chancellor Anthony Barber pushed through what became known as the Dash for Growth budget in 1972, a massive stimulus designed to win the next election. It worked for about 5 minutes, and then the 1973 oil shock hit, followed by a wage price spiral that spun out of control. By 1975, inflation in Britain reached somewhere between 24 and 27%, which means 1 in every 4 pounds of purchasing power simply evaporated in a single year. A year later, the government's deficit was running at roughly 10% of GDP, and the pound, worth over $2 in March, was sliding fast. Investors started dumping British government bonds, and something called a buyer's strike took hold, where domestic institutions just refused to lend the government any more money. The Bank of England jacked interest rates up to 15%, the highest in British history at that point, and even that brutal move failed to bring the buyers back to the table. Back in April of 1975, the Wall Street Journal had already run a headline that became infamous, telling its readers goodbye, Great Britain, and advising them to get out of sterling. By the summer of 1976, that advice was looking like genius. That June, Britain quietly arranged a $5.3 billion emergency swap line with the G10 central banks, including the Federal Reserve, the Swiss, and the Bank for International Settlements. Of that, $1.6 billion got drawn down just to defend the pound through the summer months, and every dollar of it had to be paid back by December. Britain didn't have it. By the end of September, sterling had collapsed from $2 in March down to 1.65, and the country's foreign currency reserves were about to drop to roughly $2 billion, nowhere near enough to cover the sterling balances held abroad. If those holders panicked, the pound would go into free fall, leaving Britain staring at 2 ugly outcomes: a siege economy or an outright default, possibly both. That is the moment Dennis Healey turned back from Heathrow. The next day, the 29th of September, 1976, he announced that Britain was applying to the IMF for $3.9 billion, the largest single loan the IMF had ever considered. Here is where it gets interesting, and here is where the lesson really lands for anyone watching the U.S. national debt climb. The IMF refused to just hand the money over, sending a team to London on the 1st of November that checked into Brown's hotel in Mayfair under fake names, with the group booking made under the alias Mrs. Boff. They arrived carrying a list of demands, which meant cutting public spending, tightening monetary policy, and hitting specific targets for domestic credit expansion. In plain English, austerity on terms set by Washington, not Westminster. The British cabinet erupted on the 1st of December when Healy laid out the IMF's terms. 10 out of the 13 ministers who spoke opposed them, and Prime Minister James Callaghan himself believed the cuts being demanded were excessive. Energy Secretary Tony Benn pushed an alternative economic strategy, calling for import controls, expanded public ownership, and pulling back military commitments in Cyprus and Germany, with Michael Foot backing him to the hilt. The Labour Party was tearing itself apart. Callaghan had already done something extraordinary, though. A couple of months earlier, standing in front of his own party at the Labour conference in Blackpool, the Prime Minister of the welfare state, the party of full employment, delivered this line: "We used to think you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you, in all candor, that option no longer exists, and that insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked on each occasion since the war by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy, followed by a higher level of unemployment as the next step." A Labour Prime Minister was telling his own party that the post-war Keynesian consensus had died. Political commentator Peter Riddle later wrote that all the elements of what would become Thatcherism were contained in the letter of intent sent by Denis Healy as Chancellor of the Exchequer to the International Monetary Fund in December 1976. Margaret Thatcher hadn't even won an election yet, but the policy revolution was already being written by a Labour government under instructions from the IMF. On the 15th of December 1976, Healy signed the letter of intent. The loan was approved and the cuts began. Here is the twist that still stings. Healy later admitted the whole thing might have been unnecessary because the Treasury had told him the public sector borrowing requirement for 1976 to 77 would land at about £10.5 billion. When the actual figure came in at £8.5 billion, Britain had begged the IMF for the biggest loan in its history, partly because its own treasury had botched the math. Healy wrote in his memoirs that an economist is a man who, when you ask him for a telephone number, gives you an estimate. In the end, only about half of the $3.9 billion got drawn down before the economy stabilized. North Sea oil started flowing, and the pound recovered. By 1981, sterling had climbed back above $2 and was actually too strong for British exporters. The loan was fully repaid by May 4th, 1979, the day after the general election that swept Margaret Thatcher into power, and Healy nicknamed the day Britain no longer needed the IMF standby sawed-off day. Why does any of this matter to you? Watching this in 2026 as the U.S. debt clock spins faster every year. 1976 wasn't really about a loan. That was the moment a former superpower discovered that being a former superpower doesn't exempt you from the rules of the bond market. Sterling had served as a global reserve currency since the 1800s, and after 1976, that role was effectively finished. Britain spent the next 2 decades adjusting to a smaller, more disciplined reality, and the political consensus that had governed the country since World War II was simply gone, killed in large part by inflation, deficits, and a currency the world stopped trusting. The British believed it couldn't happen to them. The Chancellor who signed that letter of intent had served in the cabinet of a country that won World War II, and he ended his career putting his signature to terms dictated by foreign technocrats checked into a London hotel under a fake name. That is the warning. Reserve currency status, military power, an empire's worth of prestige, none of it makes you immune when the bond market turns. Britain discovered that on the 28th of September, 1976, and the only question worth asking now is whether anyone else is taking notes.